Welcome back to this course, Faith and Understanding, an Introduction to Language and Theology. I'm Noel Sanderson, professor for this course. This is the second lecture in the course, and I invite you to join with me as we pray. Heavenly Father, I bring before you myself and everybody who listens to me in this course to your feet, Lord, to the foot of your throne, praying for your inspiration, for your guidance, for your, Lord, the enlightening of the Holy Spirit in all the things that we read and share and the thoughts that we have about you as we explore this idea of what it is to understand our faith and what role language has in our theology, Lord. We are learners. That is why we're doing this very course, Lord. And so, Father, you be our teacher through the Spirit, in Jesus' name, amen. Well, again, a welcome to this second lecture in this course. And in this section, it'll be a little shorter than in the first lecture, but this is going to be where we're going to think a little bit more about language and theology. I was born in Africa and raised in South Africa and lived there into my 50s. And South Africa is a country with 11 official languages. And so I grew up in a world which is very multicultural, multi-tribal, multi-ethnic, multilingual. But my personal world was, of course, English speaking. And if you've traveled anywhere in the world, you will have been privileged to understand that beyond the borders of your land, you may encounter very different languages, even alphabets. And looking even at this photograph, you realize that there are these ways in which human beings have created the means of communicating with one another and recording things, history, that is completely unintelligible to me. I don't read Korean or Japanese or any other foreign language, and certainly when I look at this picture, I realize, there are a lot of things I don't understand. I remember walking into a bank one time many years ago in Israel, and I needed to draw cash, and I couldn't get the ATM to work. So I went into this bank with my ATM card and my passport, and I walked into the bank lobby and looked around, and everything was in Hebrew. And I realized in that moment that however educated I might be, in that place, in that bank lobby, I was illiterate. There was writing all around me, banking, modern Hebrew banking language, but I couldn't read a thing. And so despite the fact that in my context, I am an educated person, in that context, actually, I was illiterate. It was as if I was an uneducated man. And that's what language does in so many ways, is unlocks power and potential, or it locks me out. And that's the power of it. So when it comes to our faith, we realize that when Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel, he didn't mean that it had to be preached only in Hebrew or Aramaic. It was in fact going to be very quickly translated into multiple languages. And so when we take the word of God, the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, translate it into other languages, we're not just changing one word for another word, but we're also having to communicate the meaning. Now, this isn't a course on Bible translation, but I'm sure that as a Christian, you appreciate that there are some challenges in translating the Bible into other languages so that those people who live in a world of that language and those constructs, cultural constructs, can get what God is saying to them. That is a very challenging task indeed. But even when we are moving amongst people who speak our own language, I moved from South Africa excuse me, to the United States, and both parts of that world speak a form of English, a version of English. But my wife and I were to quickly discover that there are common words which have different meanings. And so being misunderstood is very easy, although we were all speaking English. And so it is with our theology. There are certain assumptions that we make when we go from one place to another theologically, from one part of the world to another. Even if I go from my church tradition to another church tradition down the road in my town, and I walk into their building, I might find myself amongst unfamiliar things, but we are all at the foot of the cross. So, theology and language. Theologians use language to arrange thoughts and our thoughts about God and faith in such a way as to make God accessible, understandable, and communicable. All right, so let's just think about this. That theologians use language to arrange thoughts about God. Now, let's back up a moment, because we may be tempted to think, well, that's theologians. I'm not a theologian, because we have, in many parts of the church, been raised to think of theologians as people who sit in seminaries or in university faculties or in Bible institutions, and probably have the letters doctor in front of their name, and they're highly educated, and so these are specialists on the things of God. But in fact, I think every one of us are theologians. Perhaps we use that with a small t, lowercase t, because one view is that to think about God is to think theologically, to think about theos, it's to think about the divine. And to have thoughts about God is, in fact, to think theologically. I'm trying to think, what do I think about God? What do I imagine about God? And so we take those and we put that to language. We arrange that into some sort of order. So our purpose theologically is to make God accessible. So, for example, if you were to go out and do some street evangelism, for example, and you had perhaps a tract or some kind of pamphlet that you were handing out, or some invitation to some event to people could hear the gospel. Let's just imagine. What you're doing is you're going out on the street, you're walking up to strangers, or you're standing on a soapbox on the corner and preaching to the town square. And what are you doing? You're talking to people who may or may not be interested, and you're inviting them to consider God. Consider the invitation of God. You're wanting to make God accessible. And so that's what you do. And so you choose your language that you're using about God and the love of God and the death of Christ on the cross and the gospel. And you're trying to match that. Hopefully you're trying to match that, your language, to the lives that these people live who are walking past you in the town square. So I'm imagining that kind of outreach, which still very much happens. I think that I have certainly seen, I have observed this particularly in New York City in the underground, in the subway system, where I'd get off the train and there'd be people there with a table, and they'd be shouting at the people and trying to evangelize them, and I thought the most inappropriate way, personally, totally ineffective, but they probably felt that they were doing what God wanted them to do and they were proclaiming. But they weren't doing it in my way, in a very thoughtful way. They weren't trying to really connect with the people. They were just trying to, bombard them. So it wasn't really making God accessible. So theologians use language to arrange out their thoughts about God and faith in a way as to make God accessible. Because if your theology makes God inaccessible, then that's not really helpful, obviously. If our theology puts God out of reach and we can't understand God, the language of our theology is too high and mighty, as it were, too heavenly, that no one can really understand it at all, then we're not succeeding in our goal. And if our theology and our language of our theology doesn't communicate God, then again it has failed. So there are these three sort of tests that we want when we come to our theology and our language. Does it make God accessible? Does it make God understandable? And does it make God communicable? Can I actually effectively communicate God with the language that I'm using? Now, I grew up in a Catholic environment, and I remember as a child going off to Mass, and it was a time when everything was pretty much in Latin, other than the homily, the talk by the priest, which was normally quite short. But otherwise, everything was probably going way over my head. And by the time I became a teenager, it didn't connect with me whatsoever. It didn't make God accessible. It certainly didn't make God understandable. And as a communication exercise, it didn't work for me. I understand it worked for a lot of people, but not for me. So theology and language become very, very important. That language is context bound and the resulting constructs can be limited or even harmful to the mission of God if that language is exported out of its original social context without adaptation to the new environment. So this language, the language that we form, okay, this language that we create, this religious language, is himself context bound. It results in constructs that can be limited and even harmful to the mission of God, especially if that language is exported out of its original social context without adaptation to the new environment. This is something that missionaries deal with all the time. How do we take the language of the Bible with all of its idioms, with all of its motifs, with all of its context-bound narratives, and then put language to that which makes God accessible to someone living in the Amazon jungle or in the mountains of Burma? So, thoughts about language. I have thoughts about God. We've covered this in the first lecture, but I have thoughts about God. And sometimes we don't really sit down and think about my thoughts. I just think my thoughts. But I think it's very important for us to stop in this course and say, I need to become more conscious of my thinking about God, more reflective about my thinking about God. One of the great parts of Christian history, or parts of that history that we can learn a lot from, let me rephrase that, is some elements, and please hear me carefully here, some elements of monasticism. There were two really great events in Christian history when it came to monasticism, or can I say models of monasticism. The one was the desire, very common in parts of Europe, to withdraw from the world, to keep oneself pure from the world. And so you threw up the walls and the monastery became a place where you lived free as best you could from the world. We have St. Patrick, on the other hand, in the Celtic missions in Ireland, where in fact the monasteries were very much centers of hospitality and outreach, and where it wasn't a place of escape, but it was a place of learning and education, equipping for evangelizing the Celtic tribes of Ireland. But the truth is that there have always been those Christians who have been contemplative, who have withdrawn in order to think about God, to meditate on God, to reflect about God, and to, in that sense, grow closer to God and try and reduce the noise that comes to us from our context. Our context is, whatever context you're in, is noisy. So we start with our thoughts about God. We then describe those thoughts in our language, my language. I speak English. And so if I'm going to write something about God, if I'm going to speak, preach a sermon about God, I'm going to do it in my language. And I'm going to take this, my thoughts about God, my understanding about God, and craft a communication tool, a sermon, for example, using my language. I use my language to create those theological constructs. And I export both the language and the constructs to other contexts. And again, this is very something that missionaries have tended to do historically, although there are these shifts today in missiological practice away from the importing of the language and constructs of, say, Europe and America into Africa or South America and so on. While that is still very much happening, there are these massive shifts happening in missiological thinking and praxis, in fact. But I want us in this course, it's more about awareness. Are we aware of my thoughts about God? Are we aware of the connection between those thoughts and my language, its limitations especially, and how I use my language to develop these constructs? these fences I put around my collective thoughts? And am I aware of taking those and putting them into a different context? The result is not globalization, but what someone called amorphism. When I take my language and my constructs and I import them into another context, that is not what we call today globalism. I need to make some adaptations. So in our next slide, thoughts become language, putting thoughts to language, and framing our language. So we've gone through this in our first lecture. I want to come back to it as a reminder. Thinking, imagining God, having ideas about God, assumptions about God, understanding God. Now, if you're an atheist, you're going to say, I imagine that there is no God, like John Lennon. My ideas about God is that he doesn't exist. My assumption about God is that he's a myth, or at least a figment of my imagination only, a kind of drug I take in order to take the edge off of the harshness of life, an opiate, as it were. And a communist would, and an atheist would say, well, my understanding of God is that, well, there is no God. So even an atheist has thoughts about God. Even an atheist in that sense can say, well, you're qualified theologically, so to speak, or to be theological. But we're not atheists. So we do imagine God. We have ideas about God, make assumptions about God, and we seek an understanding of God, like Anselm. We seek to understand this God. But it's very important for us when we put all this imagining and ideas and assumption and understanding together, and we then say, okay, out of my imagining God, my ideas about God, my assumptions about God, my understanding of God, I need to construct some kind of sort of vehicle that carries my faith and which I can use to connect with others who have the same sort of ideas and assumptions about God, who imagine God in a certain way and who understand that God is like this or like that. And we collect together, but we build these constructs. Now, these constructs are the result of setting my thoughts and experiences and hermeneutic into an organized whole that serves as an apologetic for my faith choices. Why do I baptize only adult confessing people? Why do I baptize only infants? To go back to an example I gave in the first one, and you can pick many. If you're Pentecostal, you're going to say, well, I have thoughts, experiences, and hermeneutic that I've organized together to say, why am I a Pentecostal? Why do I believe what I do about the gifts of the Spirit and the infilling of the Spirit as something secondary to salvation? Or alternatively, why do I not believe that? Why do I, when I read the same scripture as my Pentecostal brother, why do I come to a different conclusion? And why does my fence around my construct look different to that brother over there? And I need to be able to explain that. That's called an apologetic. I use language to do that. And I use constructs to give it some shape so that others can say, oh, that's what that is. And so we end up with these labels. Oh, he's a Pentecostal, he's a charismatic, he's an Episcopalian, it's a Baptist. And so we have these labels for one another, or labels for ourselves. And what is this? It's the result of imagining God, having ideas about God, making assumptions about God, and God's word and God's promises, by the way, and understanding our God, my understanding of God. And when I put that all together, I have to exclude certain things and I include certain things. That's called a construct. And that is the sum of my thoughts, experience, and hermeneutic. It's organized. We build Bible colleges around it. And so we have Bible colleges that are for Baptists and seminaries for Episcopalian, Anglicans, or Pentecostals, or whoever it might be, because we want to send young people to those colleges so that they come out with the ability to be an apologist for that construct. We want to send young people to a Baptist college so that they can graduate and be good Baptist pastors or Nazarene pastors or Pentecostal pastors. In other words, they have become defenders of that construct. The assumption, however, is somewhere in all of that, for some people, I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush, is that in fact that construct is God's construct. God approves that construct. Now, historically, religious wars, especially amongst Christian groups, has been tragic because one group said, my construct is more God-like than yours. Or worse, my construct is God approved as yours is not approved. And so if you're going to practice those sorts of things as a Christian, we're going to ban you or burn you or eradicate you or persecute you. We won't tolerate that here in our town or our country. And so this thing of constructs it takes on enormous power and can be incredibly divisive and destructive historically. Now, in a postmodern world and in a postmodern, almost denominational world, while we still have denominations, it's become increasingly difficult to identify if someone says, well, I'm a fill in the blank, denomination-wise, to actually know exactly what they really believe anymore, because the boundaries of this historically very tight constructs, these boundaries were impermeable, have become very permeable. There's a lot of leakage in and out of these constructs now, and they become less and less rigid as time goes on. So again, whilst we have these constructs as very powerful things in history, and they remain powerful in all spheres of life, there's a shift happening to this idea in a postmodern world, which says there's no such thing as a solid universal truth. So your construct, you're welcome to it, but it actually no longer defines things for me. And so you find people saying, well, I am a fill in the blank again. I'm this kind of Christian, but I'm not like those kinds of Christians who have the same name. And so people find themselves having to kind of be an apologist for their own personal construct, to say, well, I go to a XYZ church, but I actually don't really agree with all those things that they're doing at that thing, etc. And so we have this splintering, really, in our time today. And so people are struggling to reconstruct constructs that are more flexible and more applicable to our age. So examples of singularity to plurality to singularity, I'm going to get into this too much here, but I want to just point out that constructs, again, we have this Judaism, and I'm going to be very simplistic here, because even within the world of Judaism in the days of Jesus, there were huge significant differences between Jews, not only in Israel, but of course also throughout the diaspora, wherever the Jews had been scattered. But there was, at the end of the day, that Jerusalem was the sort of center of Jewish religious life, even after the destruction of the temple, etc. But certainly in the time of Jesus, there was this Jerusalem council that came together to consider the question of what to do with the growing number of non-Jews who are coming to believe in Jesus Christ as their savior. And so the Jerusalem Council becomes this kind of focal point and the voice, as it were, for Judaism in Jerusalem at the time after the ascension of Christ. But the Jerusalem, not just Judaism per se, but actually of the Jewish church in Jerusalem. So although they were still all living together and they were worshiping together in the temple and the synagogues, etc., there was this number of Jewish people who believed in Christ. And so we have the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, which is all Jewish. Now we have these non-Jews who are coming to faith in Christ. And the Jerusalem Council has to make a decision to move from, well, this faith to believe in Jesus Christ means you have to become a Jew. Men must be circumcised, people must live according to the laws of kosher, the laws of Moses, and adopt everything that it is to be Jewish in terms of the ceremonies, the events, the feasts, etc., etc. You must become Jewish. But the momentous decision that they make is, in fact, that no, we're going to embrace the idea that there's going to be a plurality of inclusion. We're going to include into this historically and prophetically the Jewish faith, those who are not Jews, without making them Jews. There's this massive shift, and what it implies is they look at the construct, which was if you're to be a believer in Jesus Christ as Messiah, you must be Jewish. But what happens if God does the unthinkable and actually starts saving, as it were, the non-Jew? What then do we do with this new phenomenon? Well, their decision is momentous. And of course, we know it now as they make the decision that not to force conversion to Jewishness or to Judaism as an established religion upon them. A plurality of inclusion meant, in terms of this conversation in this lecture, a new construct emerged. Okay, that's what I want you to think of. A new construct emerged, a plurality of inclusion. Paul's warning was that there would always be a desire to pull this back to a singularity of exclusivism. In Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11, he particularly writes about this, and he uses the olive tree as an example of this, and he talks about the olive tree as both a wild olive tree and a cultivated olive tree. And if you read those passages again, you realize that Paul's warning is that God had grafted in the non-Jews. That was the plurality of inclusion, in the kingdom of God, in the church. But there would always be those who would say, you don't really belong, you don't really belong, and you need to come back. There needs to be a singularity again. We don't just all need to be one. And that's the warning of Paul in so many ways there in Romans 9, 10, and 11. There's a lot more to it than what I'm pointing out here today, but we're talking about constructs and the language. And so the Jerusalem Council says, no, we need a new construct that embraces what God is doing. That's very important language. And Paul's warning in Romans 9, 10, 11 is that there will be those who would want to actually always cut across what God is doing. Anti-Semitism is a singularity of prejudice. There's this common tie between those people all over the world who are anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, from all different kinds of cultures. There's kind of a spiritual dynamic to anti-Semitism, which has a singularity to it of prejudice against the people of God's covenant promises. Colonialism was a kind of a form of a singularity of empire and nation. Let's go and capture whole swaths of continents and turn them into Catholic or Protestant countries. More particularly, it would be a Catholic in some parts of the world, but the Protestants were a little bit behind, but they caught up with that. And so the notion of exported from Europe of a Christian country really became part and parcel of the phenomenon of colonialism. Globalization, of course, then raises up another specter of the plurality of community and confession. So we have this globalization happening. So each one of these things kind of speaks to a kind of a construct. So the Jerusalem Council said we need to create a new construct in which we include as equal believers those who are not Jewish. The warning of Paul, the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, just as an example of a construct. Anti-Semitism is a construct. People have pulled together all kinds of things about the Jewish people, created this kind of myth, and then terrible things happen. Even today as I speak, anti-Semitism is alive and well in the world. It's a singularity of prejudice. Colonialism was a singularity in one respect, and globalization challenges that. It's post-colonial. What comes after the colonization of the world? Well, this is now a globalization, a plurality of community and confessions together, celebrating the glorious, in a way, diversity of the love of Christ amongst Christians all over the world. And that's when I talk about globalization. I'm talking about it in the sense of the community of the body of Christ. So another way just to look at this is a singularity to plurality, where you have this idea of a Pharisee, a Jew, a Roman, Israel, and then moving across to the plurality of the Jews, the Greeks, empire, church, for example, or the church, or the Lord's church, etc. So there's this shifting, and there's always going to be a tension and an element of dispute between the singularity and the plurality that we see in society. And a tension there, and one hopes that in a way an acceptance comes as we embrace what God is doing. And so we have this example here in Acts 15, where some men came from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to Moses, custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. There's a singularity. To be a believer in Jesus Christ is you need to be a Jew. It's not dissimilar to the idea that if you are an Arab, you have to be a Muslim. It's a singularity. That's the connection between the language and the culture and the construct. To be an Arab, Arabism was a construct that people tried to really sell as something in which you could be a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or something else, Baha'i, but you could still be an Arab. But power of the connection between Arabic as a language and the Quran and Islam as a whole really killed that drive for Arabism and said, no, if you're an Arab, you're a Muslim, and then everything else might or might not be tolerated. But we have this move to plurality in our culture and in our faith. And so we listen to this whole story in Acts 15 of where God has visited the Gentiles and taken from them a people for his name, and the prophets had spoken about it. And so there was this idea that there had to be this embracing of a plurality now. And that's sometimes never a really easy relationship in many respects in society. When it happens on a national scale, we see countries today moving very much to more multicultural societies and multicultural suburbs, and it can create significant human tension, as we, I'm sure, probably realize. But in the body of Christ, within the church, that diversity is the norm according to what God is doing. He is saving all people who call upon his name and adding them to the church, those who are being saved. All right. So moving on, we talk a little bit about our Western theology, heritage, and impact. So you come to this huge word, tradition. Anybody who saw the movie Fiddler on the Roof from many years ago, it's still a great classic, realized that one of the great songs sung in the song is in the movie is about tradition and the changing of ways. Now, the changing of ways has been around a very, very long time. It's nothing new or modern, but as human beings, we're very attached to certain traditions, some more than others. Now, one of the reasons the Romans so disliked the Christians wasn't because they believed in a different God. The Romans believed in lots of gods, as did the Greeks. Another God wasn't necessarily the end of the world. But one of the reasons they had struggles with the Christians was because this was a new religion. And the Romans were very suspicious of new religions. So in their view, the older a religion, the more weight it carried. So the further back it could be traced in antiquity, the more legitimate it was, the more reliable it was, the more true it was, the more it had weight in Roman culture and the philosophy of life. So new religions, not just Christianity, were highly suspect. Traditions, of course, require time to develop. They come to us from the past. We inherit them, and then we add to them, and then we perpetuate them. Now, traditions, the ancient ways, are true and reliable. So tradition has this huge power, but tradition is kind of difficult to define in a way. It's a set of practices that have been done from the past, a way of thinking. This is the way we solve problems. This is the way we relate to things. This is the way we think about other people. A traditional way of thinking, a traditional way of doing, a traditional way of almost anything. Family traditions, family vacations, family meals, birthdays. How do we celebrate these things? These all become part of our traditions. And without them, we sometimes feel a little bereft. We feel a little stripped of meaning in life. So traditions are important to us, and they're not ungodly in themselves, depending on, of course, what we do with them and what the tradition is. But they tend to come to us from the past. And they impact our lives in big ways. Superstitions are sometimes what is described as traditions that have been married with hybrids, other influences. So there's a tradition which is just simply, we've been doing this way for the last 50 years. That's how we do Christmas at this family, or this is how we celebrate birthdays, or this is what we do in our church and this particular date on the calendar. But superstitions take it to another level, because superstitions then marry with traditions, but they introduce to the tradition other influences that are very frequently of a spiritual, religious nature. And so they become superstitious. They are repeated from history, so they're traditional, but they're overlaid like a cake with icing and frosting on it. They're covered with some other more nefarious, I would use the word, a spiritual belief system. And so they become superstitions. And they can very easily live comfortably with our spirituality. We find this throughout the world, where Christianity has found itself rubbing shoulders with very ancient traditions within tribal cultures. And so superstitions can arise. But it certainly exists. Superstitions exist in the West. We don't have to go to some far away foreign place to find it. It's right in our own context. Culture, tribalism, nationalism, these are all things that come to us as our heritage. So we inherit traditions, we inherit certain superstitions sometimes, or at least ways of thinking, but we also inherit our culture. Perhaps that's a tribe or a nationalism. However you relate to that, you could probably add a few of your own thoughts there. But this is all under the idea of heritage. What is it that we receive from the people around us, from our forebears? Politics. Well, we are born into nation states. Some of us born into nation states where there was a dominant religion, some for us not one particular dominant religious tradition. But we do know that historically there were Catholic and Protestant nations. This was particularly noticeable in the colonizing effect of European nations. But nevertheless, whichever it is, our politics was often framed within a religious worldview. Okay, part of our heritage, it's what we inherit. Economics, heritage of economics. The great disparities within the world today, the rich, the poor, is still there, very much so. We put spacecraft on Mars, and we send people to the moon, and we have people living on space stations and the cutting edge of science and technology, and we have people dying of preventable diseases and of starvation. A couple of hundred miles or kilometers below the space station. And so there's this crazy kind of disparity in our world of economics. And so apart from that, of course, the long-term legacy of colonialism and the post-colonial fallout of these independent nations, where the rich tended to get richer and more powerful. And so economics, slavery, indentured labor, set the tone for many, many, many generations. And out of all of those, of course, rose kind of a language and even music and song that would express people's hopes and dreams and struggles, or sometimes their triumphalism, bled into our very worship and our liturgy and the way we would speak our faith. So supremism within Christian mission and colonization by the West, this idea that the West is best, as it were, of manifest destiny, of this idea that particularly here in the United States, that this is a Christian nation, as some would believe it, and I have no doubt that God has used the United States and powerfully in terms of the propagation of the gospel around the world. There's no question about that. But the world has now changed, and it is in a very different place, as is the United States, as indeed are most nations in the world, undergoing significant transformation. But we all, no matter where we live in the world, are heirs of a heritage, and that heritage has impacted our theological thoughts about God. So whether it's traditions, just ancient ways, superstitions, culture, nationalism, politics, economics, or the idea of a kind of supremacy that we have, the superior message, the better theology, the best theology, the only theology, and that other nations must learn their theology from us. All of that is part of heritage, and as has impacted the church and the mission of the church profoundly. It's impacted our language and our constructs. But in a postmodern world, post-denominational world, we find all of that under significant pressure, and many of the so-called rules of the game being written and rewritten. Okay, theology, subjective, limited, and weighty. Our theology and Christian ideas are neither neutral nor objective, though we sometimes think that they are. There is bias in our thinking, in our thoughts about God, because we have assumptions about God. Language is a limited construct and is used to foster our limited understanding of God. And I think it's very helpful for us as students to understand the limitations of our language, the limitations of our constructs. And therefore, it limits our understanding of God. And so I think reflectively, I encourage you to step back in this course and say, Lord, let me be conscious of the subjectivity, the subjective nature of how I think about you. I think about you within my construct, within my context. Lord, help me step back and maybe see you as other Christians see you and come to a new appreciation of what that means. Traditions and culture carry authority, and our assumptions allow us to see or not see things in Scripture. So I read the Bible through the lens of my traditions and this heritage that I've spoken about in the last slide. I read the Bible through the lens of my economic privilege or disadvantage, my comfort or my poverty. And that's going to influence my thoughts about God. It's going to influence my theology about God. That's why we had liberation theology or wealth, name it and claim it theology, all arising out of people reading the same book. We must acknowledge the subjective and limited nature of these things. In essence, we have thoughts about God. We describe those thoughts in our language. We use our language to express and communicate our beliefs, which we then fence to create theological constructs to other contexts, which exercise is often described as mission. The problem is that tends to arise is that the outcome is either spiritual amorphism, foreign denominational dependence, or something in between, when we simply take my construct and my theology and I impose it on another. And so what we had was denominational dependence in the colonies and in other parts of the world that in fact could no longer be sustained, specifically post-colonial, when independence came for many of the parts of the world. But now there is a rising voice theologically in the global Christianity that the West is learning to appreciate and love. Theologians use language in itself a limited construct to arrange thoughts about God and faith in such a way as to make God accessible, understandable, and communicable. Those were the three things I suggested were tests. The language that transmits theology is context-bound, and the resulting constructs can be limited or even harmful to the mission of God if that language is exported out of its original social context without appropriate adaptation to the new environment. Neither language itself nor its resultant social, political, economic constructs are easily transmitted. It doesn't always convey. And I spent many years preaching in Africa, being translated or interpreted, whichever you prefer, into a local tribal language. And I had to learn very quickly that the way I organized my thoughts in my head, the way I expressed theological and biblical truths, and preached it in English and waited for my translator to translate that. There were times when it had to be really rearranged in his own head to make it make sense for the people that were listening to him. And so I learned to actually preach in a way that was a lot simpler, in the sense of simple sentence construction, one idea followed by another idea, and try to speak less theoretically, excuse me, and with fewer constructs. All right, so take a moment to read this. It may be helpful if we were to ponder whether our theology is from above or from below. Theology from below suggests that it is driven by people from within their unique contexts. Is it given to us by God, or do we construct it from our life and religious experiences. Bosch writes that many theologies from below arise from social sectors and the marginalized. Liberation theology or urban theology would be certainly two examples that come to my mind. Can we develop our theology from within our context? Well, the answer is yes, we can. This may be driven by pain, fear, and competitiveness, the need for power, even corruption within the church. It may be driven by a desire to end corruption or see a return to wholeness, a kind of revivalism. Theology that arises from below may be the opposite of theology received from God, though, and therein is the danger. Revelation is, after all, given to us, not created by us. And so we always have to be careful about a theology that clearly arises from my context. It may be a cry, that theology may be a cry for justice in the midst of injustice. It might be a cry for people who are drowning in misery, human misery. And I think this is something that God hears. I think that when the Hebrew people cried out to God in Egypt, kind of when they were oppressed and oppressed and oppressed and oppressed, so God heard. There was a kind of cry to God. Is there a God who cares about my suffering? And so it's not illegitimate to have a theology that arises from below, but we must be conscious of that theology having great vulnerabilities to it, because it can so narrow my focus that I really miss the greater, bigger picture. But we do have a theology that comes from above. It is called the Word of God. It is the revelation of the inspiration of Scripture. And that really has to always be the bedrock to which we take and put to test the theology that comes from below. We are often unaware of the many influences that have shaped our belief in God and the practice of our faith, especially as Christians living in the Western and Northern hemispheres. It is hoped that this course will awaken that awareness and stimulate a healthy interest and understanding of Christianity in other parts of the world. Those who do not share our history, our geopolitical reality, our faith lenses, may have or do have different theological perspectives to our own. I want us to just contemplate that for a few moments, just as we wrap this up. When differing perspectives meet and each claim good biblical exegesis, we begin to experience theology in global terms. This can leave us with a sense of theological dissonance, producing an uncomfortable wondering as to whose constructs and theology actually is correct. Whose theology is correct? And I think that's a very, very, very important question for us to ask. Who is right? Who then do we build, or how then do we build a global fellowship that is characterized by mutual grace, love, and understanding? How humble are we willing to be when faced with sincere and worshipful Christian spirituality in cultural garb profoundly different to our own? For our theological conversation to be meaningful, it requires that we possess a rare skill, namely that of reflection, specifically theological reflection. A Christianity that has triumphed through colonialism and rigid dogma tends to be unskilled in humble theological reflection. For too long, others have been burned, excommunicated, cut off, barred, or exiled as denominations and movements forged ahead in confident assurance they had had God in their grasp and on their side, according to David Bosch in his Transforming Mission. So finally, that brings us to the end of lecture number 2, and I pray that again the Holy Spirit will minister to you and give you opportunity to reflect and think about your heritage, and how it has impacted your practice of your faith and your theology and your thinking and reflecting on God. This is really about doing some reflection and opening your heart and your mind to what God is doing in our time. God bless you.